The silence stretched across Bagram Air Base like a held breath. In the Tactical Operations Center, 27 seasoned warriors, Navy SEALs who dropped into Abbottabad, Rangers who'd cleared Fallujah block by block, Marine Recon who'd painted targets in the Hindu Kush, all stood motionless, eyes locked on the massive display screens showing empty Afghan sky. The mission clock read 3:47 hours. Radio static filled the bunker, punctuated only by the distant hum of generators and the soft click of someone's prayer beads. Lieutenant Colonel Marcus "Tank" Rodriguez, a man who'd earned his call sign by literally driving a Bradley through a Taliban stronghold, shifted his weight and muttered under his breath, "Where the hell is she?" His question hung in the recycled air like incense in a cathedral, unanswered and growing heavier by the second. The operation, codenamed Broken Arrow 6, had been designed around a single, impossible extraction. 12 American hostages, including 2 senators and a CIA station chief, held in a mountain compound that satellite imagery showed as an impregnable fortress carved into solid rock. Every conventional rescue scenario had been wargamed to death: helicopter insertion, suicide against the SAM sites, ground assault, a 3-day advance through Taliban-controlled territory with zero surprise, cruise missile strike, unacceptable collateral damage with the hostage's location unknown within the complex. The Joint Chiefs had been ready to classify it as an acceptable loss when a voice from the back of the briefing room had spoken up. "I can get them out." The words had come from Captain Reina "Ghost" Valdez, a pilot whose personnel file read like something from a fever dream. MIT graduate at 19, Top Gun at 22. The only woman ever selected for the classified Red Flag Nellies program. Her F-22 Raptor bore 67 mission marks, each one a story the Pentagon preferred to keep buried in black folders. But it wasn't her credentials that had made the room fall silent. It was the absolute certainty in her voice, spoken with the quiet authority of someone who'd already calculated the physics of the impossible. Now, 3 days later, she was 17 minutes overdue for radio contact, flying alone through airspace that the CIA had classified as hostile beyond acceptable parameters. The compound sat 8,000 feet above sea level, surrounded by peaks that scraped 14,000 feet into the thin mountain air. Surface-to-air missiles nested in caves like sleeping dragons. The window for extraction was closing faster than a coffin lid. Tank Rodriguez checked his watch again, the luminous hands mocking him in the artificial twilight of the operations center. Every man in that room had faced death before, but none of them had ever felt quite so helpless as they did waiting for a single woman to prove that miracles still happened at 30,000 feet. The radio crackled once, twice, then went silent again. Somewhere in the darkness above the Hindu Kush, Captain Reina Valdez was either dead or about to rewrite every textbook on aerial combat. The problem was, nobody in that bunker could tell the difference. "Ghost lead, this is Bagram Actual." Tank's voice carried the strain of a man trying to sound confident while his world crumbled. "Ghost lead, radio check over." The silence that answered him felt like staring into an open grave. Outside, the first hints of dawn were beginning to touch the eastern mountains, and with daylight would come the full fury of every enemy fighter in a 100-mile radius. Captain Valdez had volunteered for this mission knowing she might not come home. What none of them had understood, sitting in that air-conditioned briefing room 72 hours ago, was that her definition of coming home might be very different from theirs. The Ghost had earned her call sign for a reason, and reasons like that don't disappear just because good men are praying for miracles. In the eerie quiet of the operations center, someone's equipment beeped softly, marking another minute past, another minute closer to calling off the search and marking 13 Americans as acceptable losses in the global war on terror. Tank Rodriguez found himself staring at the empty sky on his monitors, wondering if he just witnessed the end of the most decorated pilot in Air Force history, or the beginning of a legend that would outlive them all. The mountains of Afghanistan had swallowed countless warriors over the centuries: British regulars, Soviet paratroopers, American Marines. But they'd never faced anything quite like Captain Raina "Ghost" Valdez, alone in her F-22 Raptor, carrying the weight of 13 lives and the impossible mathematics of hope. 67 combat missions, 67 successful returns. The question hanging in the recycled air of Bagram Air Base was whether the 68th would be different, or whether the Ghost was about to prove that some legends are worth believing in, even when the sky itself seems empty of miracles. The radio crackled once more, a burst of static that could have been interference or could have been a transmission from beyond the veil of the possible. In the Tactical Operations Center, 27 of America's finest warriors held their breath and waited for a ghost to speak. Captain Raina Valdez had been 11 years old when she'd first seen an F-22 Raptor slice across the sky above her grandmother's house in San Antonio. The sonic boom had shattered 3 windows and sent the family dog howling under the porch, but Raina had stood transfixed in the backyard, watching the angular gray shadow disappear into the Texas blue like a knife cutting silk. Her grandmother, Esperanza Valdez, had found her there 20 minutes later, still staring upward with tears streaming down her cheeks. "Mija," the old woman had said, placing weathered hands on her granddaughter's shoulders, "why are you crying?" Raina had wiped her nose with the back of her hand and spoken words that would echo through her life like a prophecy. "Because it's the most beautiful thing I've ever seen, and I know I'm supposed to fly one." Esperanza had smiled the knowing smile of a woman who'd raised 6 children and buried 2 husbands, understanding that some dreams don't ask permission. They simply announce themselves like thunder. 23 years later, Captain Valdez was living inside that childhood vision, but the reality was more complex than any 11-year-old could have imagined. The F-22 wasn't just beautiful. It was a 40-ton precision instrument of American air superiority, capable of engaging 8 targets simultaneously while remaining invisible to enemy radar. In her hands, it became something approaching poetry written in contrails and missile exhaust. Her callsign had been earned during her 3rd deployment, over the skis of Syria. A formation of 4 Russian Su-57 had been harassing American reconnaissance flights, playing a deadly game of aerial chicken that had already resulted in 2 international incidents. The Pentagon's solution was to send the Ghost, a pilot whose radar signature was so minimal that enemy controllers often reported her F-22 as a flock of migrating birds. The engagement had lasted exactly 47 seconds. When it was over, 3 Russian fighters were limping home with damaged systems and wounded pride, and the 4th was making an emergency landing at a Turkish airbase, its pilot radiating distress calls that would later be classified above top secret. Captain Valdez had never fired a shot. She'd simply appeared where physics said she couldn't be, maneuvered in ways that violated everything the Russians thought they knew about American capabilities, and vanished back into the stratosphere like morning mist. The Russian pilots' debriefing transcripts, obtained through intelligence channels that officially didn't exist, all used the same word: ghost. Within a week, every fighter jock from Langley to Yokota knew the story. Within a month, Captain Valdez had a new callsign and a reputation that preceded her into every briefing room from the Pentagon to NORAD. But reputation and respect were different currencies in the military, and Raina had learned early that earning one didn't guarantee the other. She'd been the only woman in her flight training class, the only Latina in advanced tactical school, the only pilot under 30 selected for the classified programs that didn't appear on any official roster. Each milestone had been accompanied by whispers that she was filling quotas, that her scores were inflated, that she flew pretty but couldn't handle real combat pressure. The whispers had followed her through her first deployment, her first kill, her first medals ceremony where she'd stood at attention, while generals pinned ribbons to her dress blues and photographers captured images for recruiting brochures. They'd quieted somewhat after Syria, muted further after her performance over the South China Sea, and fallen to respectful silence after the night she'd single-handedly prevented a Russian bomber from reaching the USS Gerald Ford during a freedom of navigation operation. But whispers have a way of persisting in military culture, especially when they concern someone who doesn't fit the traditional mold of what a warrior should look like. At 5'3" and 120 pounds, Captain Valdez looked more like a college student than a combat pilot. Her voice on the radio was crisp and professional, but unmistakably feminine. Her maintenance crew, all men who'd been working on fighters since before she was born, had initially treated her with the polite condescension reserved for officers who didn't know the difference between a pitot tube and a refueling probe. That had changed after the first time they'd watched her conduct a pre-flight inspection. She'd spent 2 hours going over every system, every connection, every surface with the methodical precision of a surgeon preparing for heart transplant. When she'd found a hairline crack in a wing attachment point that 3 previous inspections had missed, the senior master sergeant in charge of her aircraft had quietly revised his opinion of the young captain who looked like she belonged in a boardroom instead of a cockpit. Now, 17 minutes overdue and flying through some of the most dangerous airspace in the world, Captain Reina Valdez was about to discover whether all those years of proving herself had been preparation for this moment, or whether the mountains of Afghanistan would become her final resting place. The mission briefing had been classified at levels that required senators to obtain special clearance just to know it was happening. The hostage compound, designated Target Raptor, sat like a medieval fortress carved into the living rock of the Hindu Kush. Intelligence estimates put the defensive capabilities at medieval levels too, if medieval fortresses had been equipped with Russian SA-15 surface-to-air missiles and a radar network that could track a Sparrow at 20 miles. Ghost Lead, your ingress route takes you through the Khyber Gap at Angels 25. Lieutenant Colonel Rodriguez had explained during the briefing, his laser pointer tracing a red line through terrain that looked like the surface of Mars. You'll have a 13-minute window between satellite coverage gaps, 13 minutes to penetrate hostile airspace, locate and neutralize the SAM sites, conduct the extraction, and egress before half the Taliban air defense network knows you were there. Captain Valdez had studied the mission parameters with the same intensity she brought to everything else: fuel calculations, weather patterns, escape routes, contingency plans for when the contingency plans failed, the mathematics of the impossible reduced to numbers on a computer screen and waypoints on a GPS display. "What about close air support?" Major Jennifer Barnes had asked. Barnes was a warthog pilot, a veteran of more mud-and-blood missions than anyone cared to count. Her A-10 could loiter for hours, providing covering fire while ground teams maneuvered. But this wasn't that kind of mission. "Negative on CAS," Rodriguez had replied. "Ghost Lead goes in alone. Minimal signature, minimal exposure. The compound has 12 American hostages and an estimated 40 enemy combatants. Collateral damage is not an option." The room had fallen silent as the implications sank in. A single F-22, operating without support, tasked with a precision mission that would challenge an entire squadron. It was the kind of operation that looked simple on paper and killed people in the execution. "Sir," Captain Valdez had said, her voice carrying the quiet confidence that had become her trademark, "I'll need detailed geological surveys of the target area. Rock composition, fault lines, structural weak points. If I'm going in alone, I need to know exactly where to apply pressure." Rodriguez had looked at her with the expression of a man watching someone volunteer for a suicide mission while discussing it like a physics problem. "Ghost, you understand the odds here. Even with your capabilities, this is—" "Possible," she'd interrupted gently. "Difficult, but possible. The compound's primary weakness isn't its defenses, it's its location. High altitude, limited escape routes, carved into sedimentary rock that fractures predictably under specific stress loads. Give me the geological data and 48 hours to run simulations, and I'll give you 13 Americans home for dinner." The confidence in her voice hadn't been bravado. It had been calculation, the result of a mind that saw aerial combat not as chaos but as physics, not as violence but as mathematics with explosive variables. Captain Reina Valdez had spent her entire career preparing for the moment when impossible became necessary, when the difference between success and failure would be measured in milliseconds and degrees of bank angle. Now, flying through mountain air so thin that her Raptor's engines were running at reduced efficiency, she was about to discover whether all that preparation had been enough, or whether some problems were too complex even for her particular brand of calculated precision. The compound appeared on her heads-up display as a cluster of thermal signatures arranged around what looked like the mouth of a cave. Intelligence had been right about the location. It was a natural fortress, accessible only by a narrow mountain road that switchbacked up the side of a cliff face. But intelligence had been wrong about the defenses. Instead of the estimated 4 SAM sites, her sensors were painting 7, arranged in overlapping fields of fire that would make approach from any direction a death sentence for conventional aircraft. "Ghost lead to Bagram Actual," she transmitted, her voice steady despite the circumstances. "Target acquired. Defenses are heavier than briefed. Request permission to deviate from planned approach vector." The radio crackled with interference from the mountains, but Rodriguez's response came through clearly enough. "Ghost lead, you are cleared for approach deviation. Be advised, satellite coverage gap begins in 8 minutes. Once you're dark, we won't be able to provide support or extraction if things go sideways." The unspoken message was clear. If something went wrong, she'd be on her own in hostile territory with no chance of rescue. "Copy, Bagram Actual. Ghost lead is beginning approach. See you on the other side." She switched off the radio and banked her F-22 into a descent that would take her below the radar coverage of the SAM sites. The Raptor's stealth characteristics would keep her invisible to most sensors, but getting close enough to conduct the extraction would require flying through valleys where stealth mattered less than raw piloting skill. The mountains rose around her like the walls of a cathedral built by giants, peaks reaching toward a sky that was already beginning to lighten with the approach of dawn. In 6 hours, the sun would make her aircraft visible to every enemy fighter in Afghanistan. In 6 hours, the hostages would either be free or dead, and Captain Reina "Ghost" Valdez would either be a legend or a memory. She armed her weapons systems and began her descent into the Valley of Shadows, carrying with her the hopes of 13 Americans and the weight of a reputation that had taken 15 years to build. Behind her, the first light of dawn was beginning to paint the eastern peaks gold, and ahead of her lay the kind of mission that separated true pilots from those who just flew planes. The Ghost was going to war, alone against impossible odds, guided by mathematics and intuition in equal measure. What happened next would determine whether legends were made or broken in the thin air above the Hindu Kush. The first SAM site revealed itself as a heat bloom on her thermal imaging, nestled in a cave opening 40 feet above the valley floor. Captain Valdez studied the signature through her heads-up display, calculating angles and timing with the methodical precision that had kept her alive through 67 previous missions. The SA-15 had a maximum engagement range of 12 kilometers, but its effectiveness dropped significantly in the thin mountain air. More importantly, its radar system had a blind spot directly below its firing arc, a design flaw that few pilots knew about and fewer still had the skill to exploit. She rolled her F-22 into a knife-edge descent, using the valley walls to mask her approach. At this altitude, nearly 10,000 feet above sea level, the Raptor's performance envelope was reduced by 15%. Her engines strained in the thin air, her control surfaces responding sluggishly to inputs that would have been crisp and immediate at sea level. But physics was physics, and Captain Valdez had always been better at mathematics than most people were at breathing. The compound's layout became clearer as she approached. The main facility was carved into the mountainside like a multi-level parking garage, with defensive positions at each level covering the approaches below. Intelligence estimates had been accurate about one thing: the rock was sedimentary, layered sandstone and shale that would fracture predictably under sufficient pressure. What they hadn't mentioned was the natural chimney system that ran through the mountain, creating air currents that would affect weapon trajectory in ways that couldn't be calculated from satellite imagery. Geological weak point identified, she murmured to herself, studying the thermal patterns that revealed the mountain's internal structure. The entire compound was essentially balanced on a stone shelf that protruded from the main peak like a balcony. Remove enough support material from the right locations, and physics would do the rest. But the precision required would demand flying through defensive fire that could down a squadron of conventional fighters. Her first target was the command bunker, identified by its electromagnetic signature, and the cluster of communication antennas that sprouted from its roof like steel flowers. Captain Valdez armed a single GBU-39 small-diameter bomb, its guidance system already locked onto coordinates that she'd calculated based on structural analysis conducted while flying through air so turbulent it was like navigating inside a washing machine. The release was timed to the millisecond, the bomb separating from her aircraft at the precise moment when velocity, altitude, and trajectory aligned with mathematical perfection. She banked hard left, using the mountain's bulk to shield her from the SAM sights that were beginning to track her heat signature, and counted down the seconds until impact. The explosion lit up the valley like a camera flash, and suddenly every defensive position in the compound knew exactly where she was. Surface-to-air missiles began launching from caves that had been invisible until their rocket motors ignited, creating a constellation of death that rose toward her Raptor with the inexorable certainty of gravity in reverse. Captain Valdez had been expecting this. Modern air defense networks were designed around the assumption that attacking aircraft would maintain safe standoff distances, engaging targets with long-range weapons while remaining outside the envelope of defensive fire. The Ghost had built her reputation on the willingness to get close enough to count the rivets on enemy aircraft, and this mission would require flying closer to hostile weapons than any sane pilot would attempt. She rolled inverted and pulled her F-22 into a descent so steep that her altimeter looked like a stopwatch counting down to impact. Missile proximity alarms screamed in her headset as SA-15s and shoulder-fired Stingers created a web of exhaust trails in her wake. But she was inside their minimum engagement range now, moving too fast and too low for their guidance systems to track effectively. The second target was the main entrance to the compound, a steel door built into the mountain face and protected by interlocking fields of machine gun fire from positions that had been chiseled into the rock with the patience of medieval stonemasons. Captain Valdez selected another small-diameter bomb, but this one she programmed for delayed detonation. The explosion would come 30 seconds after impact, giving her time to clear the area before the shock wave could damage her aircraft. She pulled out of her dive barely 50 feet above the valley floor, her Raptor's afterburners painting twin cones of fire against the pre-dawn darkness. The bomb release came at a speed that made precision almost impossible, but almost impossible had been the theme of her entire career. The weapon separated cleanly, its guidance fins adjusting for wind and altitude as it arced toward the fortified entrance. Behind her, the first explosion had done more than destroy a command bunker. It had triggered a landslide that was already beginning to undermine the compound's foundation. Chunks of sandstone, the size of automobiles, were breaking away from the cliff face, and the entire structure was beginning to shift as the mountain rearranged itself according to the demands of geology and gravity. "Time to go to work," Captain Valdez whispered, arming her 20 cannon and beginning a climbing turn that would position her for strafing runs against the remaining SAM sites. The extraction itself would be the easy part, a precision hover while combat rescue specialists fast-roped from a helicopter that was already en route from Bagram. But first, she had to clear a landing zone in terrain that had been specifically chosen for its impossibility to land in. The third SAM site opened fire as she completed her turn, missiles streaking past her canopy close enough that she could see the Cyrillic markings on their warheads. Captain Valdez responded with a burst of cannon fire that turned the cave mouth into a shower of sparks and shattered stone, the explosive rounds detonating on impact with enough force to collapse the tunnel system behind the launch position. Her fuel gauge was beginning to show the yellow warning light, and she still had 4 more defensive positions to neutralize before the extraction helicopter would have a chance of survival. But fuel had always been a secondary concern for the Ghost. She'd learned to fly as if every mission was a one-way trip, as if coming home was a luxury rather than a guarantee. The mountain air was growing lighter as dawn approached, and with it would come the full attention of every Taliban fighter within 100 miles. Captain Reina Valdez checked her weapons status, calculated her remaining ammunition, and began her next attack run with the calm precision of a woman who had always known that legends were built one impossible mission at a time. The fourth SAM site never had a chance to fire. Captain Valdez came at it from directly above, diving through air so thin that her Raptor's controls felt mushy and unresponsive, but her aim was surgical. A single burst from her 20 cannon turned the missile battery into scrap metal, and the cave that housed it into a tomb. The explosion echoed off the valley walls like thunder, and somewhere in the compound below, 13 American hostages heard the sound of freedom arriving at the speed of sound. But the Ghost wasn't done yet. The 5th and 6th sites were positioned to provide overlapping coverage of the landing zone, their crews already swiveling their launchers toward the sound of her engines. She had perhaps 30 seconds before they achieved firing solutions, 30 seconds to eliminate 2 targets while flying through air currents that were throwing her aircraft around like a toy in a hurricane. The solution came to her with the clarity that had always marked moments of perfect tactical awareness. Instead of engaging the SAM sites directly, she targeted the cliff face above them, using precision bombing to trigger another controlled avalanche. The geological survey data she'd studied during mission planning had revealed a fracture line in the stone, a weakness that could be exploited by someone who understood how mountains fell apart. Her remaining small-diameter bomb struck the cliff face at the exact point where sedimentary layers met metamorphic rock, and the mountain responded with a roar that could be heard for miles. Thousands of tons of stone broke away from the peak, cascading down the slope with the inevitability of gravity and the precision of careful calculation. The 2 remaining SAM sites disappeared beneath an avalanche that had been triggered by mathematics and delivered with the signature of a woman who had never met a physics problem she couldn't solve. The compound was now open for business, its defenses neutralized, and its foundation undermined to the point where the entire structure was beginning to list toward the valley like a ship taking on water. But the mission was only half complete. Captain Valdez still had to provide close air support for the extraction team, and she was running low on everything except determination and the kind of flying skill that couldn't be taught in any school. Her radio crackled with the voice of Lieutenant Colonel Rodriguez, distant but clear. "Ghost Lead, Rescue 1 is inbound to your location. ETA 6 minutes. Be advised, we're picking up multiple enemy aircraft launching from air bases to your south and east. You're about to have company." Captain Valdez checked her fuel gauge again and performed rapid mental calculations. 6 minutes to maintain air superiority over the compound, followed by however long it took to load 13 hostages onto a helicopter, followed by escort duty through hostile airspace all the way back to Bagram. Her F-22 had enough fuel for perhaps half of that mission, and no margin for extended combat maneuvering. Copy, Bagram Actual. Ghost Lead will maintain overwatch until extraction is complete. Advise Rescue 1 that the landing zone is clear but unstable. They'll have maybe 10 minutes before the whole mountainside comes down. She rolled her aircraft into a lazy circle above the compound, conserving fuel while keeping her sensors trained on the approaches that enemy fighters would use. Below her, the compound was disintegrating in slow motion. The controlled avalanche had done more damage than she'd calculated, undermining not just the defensive positions but the entire structural integrity of the installation. Sections of the facility were already collapsing into the valley, and the remainder was visibly sagging as the mountain continued to rearrange itself. But the hostages were still alive. Her thermal imaging showed heat signatures moving inside the facility, 13 distinct forms that matched the profiles of the missing Americans. They were in the lower levels, probably moved there when the bombing began, but they were mobile and apparently uninjured. The extraction team would have to work fast, but the targets were confirmed viable. Ghost Lead, this is Rescue 1. I have visual on your position. That's some impressive landscaping work down there. Are you sure it's safe to land? The voice belonged to Chief Warrant Officer Patricia Angel Morrison, a helicopter pilot whose reputation for impossible rescues was almost as legendary as the Ghost's air-to-air record. Rescue 1, landing zone is stable for the next 8 to 10 minutes. After that, I'd recommend finding somewhere else to be. The mountain is still settling, and I don't think it's finished falling down yet. Captain Valdez banked her F-22 to provide overwatch as the rescue helicopter began its descent into terrain that looked more like the surface of an alien planet than anything found on Earth. The extraction itself proceeded with military precision. Combat rescue specialists fast-roped from Angel's helicopter, moved through the unstable compound with the efficiency of men who'd practiced this scenario hundreds of times, and emerged with 13 dazed but walking hostages in less than 7 minutes. It was a textbook operation, conducted under fire in impossible terrain, and it would have been perfect except for the 4 enemy fighters that appeared on Captain Valdez's radar screen just as the helicopter was lifting off. Rescue 1, you have bandits inbound from the southeast, estimated 4 aircraft, probably MiG-29s. Recommend immediate egress while I deal with the interference. The Ghost armed her remaining air-to-air missiles and turned to face the approaching threat. 4 against 1, with minimal fuel and ammunition, over terrain that left no room for error. It was exactly the kind of odds that had made her legend. The enemy fighters appeared as specks against the dawn sky, their contrails drawing lines of intent across the crystalline air of the high mountains. Captain Valdez identified them through her targeting system. 4 MiG-29 Fulcrums, probably flown by Taliban pilots who had learned their trade in Pakistani Air Force schools before defecting to join the jihad. They were competent but predictable, following intercept patterns that had been obsolete when her father was learning to fly. She had 2 AIM-120 AMRAAM missiles remaining, enough for 2 kills if her shots were perfect. The other 2 fighters would have to be dealt with using her cannon, assuming she could maneuver them into firing positions before her fuel ran out. It was the kind of tactical problem that looked simple on paper and killed people in the execution. Angel, you are cleared to depart the area. Ghost Lead will provide escort as able. She switched her radio to combat frequency and began the mental calculations that would determine whether 13 American hostages made it home alive or became statistics in someone's after-action report. The mathematics of aerial combat were complex but not chaotic. Every aircraft had performance envelopes, every pilot had reaction times, every missile had guidance parameters that could be exploited by someone who understood physics better than their opponents understood tactics. Captain Valdez had built her career on the principle that superior knowledge could overcome superior numbers, and she was about to test that principle against odds that would have made seasoned squadron commanders request backup. The first MiG fired from maximum range, its missile streaking toward her F-22 with the confidence of a pilot who believed stealth technology was just propaganda. Captain Valdez waited until the last possible moment before deploying countermeasures, chaff and flares creating a cloud of false targets that confused the incoming weapon long enough for her to slip sideways through the sky like a ghost made manifest. Her responding shot came from a position that should have been impossible to achieve. Launched from an angle that violated everything the Taliban pilots thought they knew about American fighter tactics. The AMRAAM guided true, its warhead detonating close enough to the lead MiG to send it tumbling toward the valley floor in a shower of burning debris. 3 against 1 now, but they were learning. The remaining pilots began to coordinate their attacks, one providing distraction while the others maneuvered for killing shots. It was a sound tactic that would have worked against most pilots, but Captain Valdez had never been most pilots. She pulled her Raptor into a climb so steep that her engine strained against the thin mountain air, reaching altitude where the MiG's performance dropped off significantly, while her own aircraft remained marginally effective. The second missile shot came from above, fired down through air so clear that she could see the expression of surprise on the enemy pilot's face as his aircraft disintegrated around him. 2 against 1, and her fuel gauge was showing red. Somewhere below, Angel's helicopter was carrying 13 American hostages toward safety, but they wouldn't be truly safe until someone cleared the sky of enemy fighters. Captain Valdez had signed up for this mission knowing she might not come home, but she hadn't expected to find out so definitively. The remaining MiGs were separating, trying to force her to split her attention between multiple threats. It was a classic tactic, and it would have worked if she'd been thinking tactically instead of mathematically. But the Ghost had always seen aerial combat as a physics problem, and physics problems had elegant solutions for those who understood the underlying principles. She rolled inverted and dove toward the valley floor, using the terrain to mask her heat signature while drawing the enemy fighters into a pursuit curve that would bring them within cannon range. Her 20 ammunition was limited, but at close range, every shot counted double, and she'd been practicing close-range gunnery since before some of these pilots had learned to tie their shoes. The engagement lasted 47 seconds, approximately the same duration as her legendary encounter over Syria. When it was over, 2 more Taliban fighters were scattered across the mountains of Afghanistan, and Captain Raina Ghost Valdez was alone in the sky above the Hindu Kush, flying on fumes and adrenaline toward a reunion with the ground that was beginning to look inevitable. Her fuel gauge was showing less than 10 minutes of flight time remaining, and Bagram Air Base was 30 minutes away under optimal conditions. The mathematics were unforgiving. She was going to run out of gas before she reached friendly territory, and ejection over Taliban-controlled mountains was only marginally better than controlled flight into terrain. But legends aren't made by accepting the limitations of mathematics. They're made by finding solutions where others see only problems, by flying aircraft beyond their design specifications, and by never giving up even when physics itself seems to be working against you. Captain Valdez began a shallow descent toward the valley floor, calculating glide ratios and wind patterns with the precision of a woman who had spent her entire career preparing for the moment when everything would depend on her ability to make a 30-ton fighter jet do things that defied both gravity and common sense. Behind her, the compound was now completely collapsed, the mountain having finished the process of rearrangement that she'd begun with her precision bombing. Ahead of her lay terrain that was hostile in every sense of the word, populated by enemies who would pay bounties for captured American pilots, and terrain that had killed more aviators than all the surface-to-air missiles in Afghanistan. But the Ghost had never been particularly impressed by impossibility. She'd made a career out of making the improbable look routine, and she wasn't about to let a simple matter of fuel shortage spoil her perfect mission record. Somewhere ahead lay Bagram Air Base, safety, and a debriefing that would probably be classified above her own security clearance. All she had to do was get there. The first sign of trouble came as a subtle vibration in her control stick. the kind of feedback that experienced pilots learn to recognize as the aircraft's way of saying that something important was about to fail. Captain Valdez ran through her emergency checklist while simultaneously calculating her glide distance and identifying potential emergency landing sites in terrain that looked like the surface of Mars during a particularly bad day. Her engines were still producing power, but the fuel flow indicators were showing irregularities that suggested damage from the intense maneuvering she'd conducted during the dogfight. The G-forces generated during close-range aerial combat put stresses on aircraft systems that manufacturers tested for but hoped never to see in actual operations, and the Ghost had been pulling maneuvers that would have impressed airshow pilots. Bagram Actual, this is Ghost Lead. I'm experiencing fuel system irregularities and may not be able to maintain current flight profile. Request vectors to nearest emergency field. Her voice remained calm, professional, the kind of tone that suggested mechanical difficulties were merely interesting problems to be solved rather than life-threatening emergencies. Ghost Lead, be advised that all emergency fields in your area are considered hostile territory. Recommend maintaining current heading for Bagram. We have emergency services standing by. Lieutenant Colonel Rodriguez's voice carried the strain of a man who had just realized that the pilot who'd saved 13 American lives might be about to become a casualty herself. Captain Valdez checked her instruments again, confirming what she already knew. Her aircraft was dying around her, systems failing in the cascade pattern that marked the transition from controlled flight to emergency gliding. She had perhaps 15 minutes before her engines quit entirely. 15 minutes to cover distance that would normally require 30 minutes of powered flight. The solution, when it came to her, was so simple that she almost smiled. Physics was physics, regardless of political boundaries or military designations. Her F-22 Raptor was essentially a very sophisticated glider with engines attached, and gliders had been landing in unpowered flight since the Wright brothers figured out how to get off the ground. Bagram Actual, Ghost Lead is declaring emergency and transitioning to best glide configuration. I'm going to stretch this bird as far as she'll go and see if I can't make it interesting. She adjusted her flight controls for maximum lift-to-drag ratio, transforming her fighter jet into something that resembled a very fast, very expensive sailplane. The mountains flowed beneath her like a frozen ocean, peaks and valleys arranged in patterns that would have been beautiful if she'd had time to appreciate the scenery. But Captain Valdez was focused on the mathematics of unpowered flight, calculating sync rates in.